Okay, welcome everyone. This is going to be a very wonderful event. My name is Margaret Scott. I am with the New York Southeast Asia Network, and we, the network, are hosting today's talk. And I'm delighted to invite and say hello to Karen Stotler, who is an associate professor of anthropology at Queens College and at the Graduate Center of City University of New York. This is her second book that she's going to talk about today. First of all, I have to say it is beautiful. It is about images, and Karen did an amazing job in putting the images in the book and really making it so that you can enter into the world she's describing. There's a photo essay at the beginning of it, and then it's littered with the kinds of images that she's talking about. So, before we get started, oh my goodness, there's a lot of people on. Hello, everyone, and it's great you could all come and join us. First of all, if you have any problems, use the chat to tell us about technical problems. When and if you have questions, and we look forward to hearing them, hit on the Q&A at the bottom and type in your question, and we will try to get to all of them. So this is our last event of the year, and I'm thrilled we're doing it. So Karen, please tell us a bit about the genesis of this book, why you decided to do it, and how you went about it.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. I can't see any of you, so it's a little strange, but thank you for coming. And thank you for having me, Margaret and John and Serena. So let me tell you about this book. So it really started when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork, very long time ago, during that period between 1998 and 2000, which was immediately after the end of a 32-year authoritarian regime. And it was just a very exhilarating time to be in Indonesia, but also a time that was very fraught with anxiety and uncertainty. And so I was doing a research project, as some of you know, on popular photography and the post-colonial history of photography in Indonesia. But there was all this other stuff going on around me that was incredibly interesting and that I was sort of absorbing and attending to alongside the work that was my actual dissertation project. And in particular, I was noticing, first of all, that people were imagining what it would be like to live in a democracy, what that would mean, and what the sort of possibilities and dangers were of that experiment. And at the same time, there was a kind of technological shift happening. So there were sort of two new eras, one political and one technological, or we could talk about a new media environment, that were coming about at the same time. And that was what really fascinated me, and what was sort of the core issue that set me on the path to writing this book, was to think about what was happening with this political opening, and what was happening with this media opening, this diversification of media, this privatization of media, the development of all different kinds of media platforms that were making for a much more participatory kind of public sphere, and one that was really in which images were operating in very intensive and new ways. And that kind of became clear to me that images were doing a kind of work in this moment that was new. And that became the kind of core question that I started to ask, is what is the relationship between this new media ecology, the aspirations and sort of travails of democracy, and the political work of images.
So for anyone who hasn't yet seen the book, I should have said that it's actually, the title is Demanding Images, Democracy, Mediation, and the Image Event in Indonesia. And Karen brings, Dr. Strassler brings an amazing array of talents to this book, because she's an anthropologist, understands and tells us what these changes of technology do to public space and the visuality of politics. And it's also a bit of a biography of the last 20 years in Indonesia. And maybe if we can walk through some of the points, the moments that become image events in Karen's vocabulary, you'll understand the way this book has many levels and is so rich. And so why don't we start with Karen, you telling us the way in which the images of Suharto, money, and then after the fall of Suharto, the first really important, the killing of Munir, how that captured both the euphoria and the anxiety at the turn of the century.
Okay, well, so thank you. Let me start just by saying what I mean by image event, because that's kind of a core concept. So as I was trying to understand the political work that images were doing, I realized that the vocabulary that I had for thinking about images and talking about images wasn't quite doing the work that I wanted it to do. I wanted a language that would help me to articulate the volatility of images and the ways that images are not just reflections on politics or commentary on them, but are integral to the process of politics, political imagining, political communication, and have an eventful quality to them in that images also unfold. They don't remain static. They do different kinds of work in different moments as they move across different media channels. They make different effects happen. They speak to different publics and they invoke different publics. And so I wanted a language for that. And that's how I came to the language of eventfulness, to think about images as happenings that unfold and that are unfinished, that continue to reverberate and ripple and have sort of always have potential to be reanimated in different ways. And so a lot of the images I'm looking at in this book are images that kind of recycle older imageries and put them into new forms, layering them with different kinds of commentary, or twist them to take on new meanings in different contexts. So the first chapter that Margaret was alluding to is a chapter on images of money. And particularly, there was a 50,000 rupiah bill with former President Suharto's face on it that remained in circulation until the year 2000. So for the first 2 years of the Reformasi period, it was still out there, and it became a kind of symbol of corruption and of the continued political influence of Suharto and Suharto's money in the political arena. So I'm going to share a screen and show a couple of images from that chapter. Bear with me. Okay, hopefully everyone can see this image. Are you seeing it?
I am. So Karen, I'm assuming everybody else can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is, for example, an image of a political protest where students have covered themselves with photocopied images of the 50,000 rupiah bill as a way to launch a protest against what is called money politics, right? The use of money to buy votes and to corrupt the political process. And this is just one example of the way this bill became used. But the bill was also reimagined in the lead up to the first elections in 1999. The people made a very popular sticker emerge that showed Megawati Soekarno-Putri, who was the opposition candidate, one of the opposition candidates against Suharto, on this bill. So it reimagined money in a kind of utopian idiom of reform. And it sort of played around with the iconography. It changed the slogans to be reform slogans. So what I'm interested in that chapter is thinking about how this state sign, which is a sign of authority and of the power of the state, gets taken up by people who use technologies like scanners and Photoshop and right, to produce these images that then circulate all over the place. Here's a becak driver with an old one stuck on his becak. So they appear in people's homes, in their workplaces, in their wallets sometimes, and all over the place. And they have a kind of political currency as an image of what an authentic politics might look like at that moment.
And as we can talk about Munir very quickly, and you could show some street. Munir was a human rights activist who was assassinated by poisoning, and it was one of the first moments when it was clear that reformasi was going to be not just immediately handed on a silver platter to anyone. And then, if you don't mind, while we're still on images, if you could go from Munir into the beginnings of the polarization over public space and morality issues that emerged. And this, I especially want you to tell us about Pink Swing.
Okay. So just to say something about sort of the arc of the book, the first two chapters are really about this very early moment between around 1998 to 2000, which is a moment of great sense of possibility and great anxiety. And there's sort of two chapters. One is the money chapter that I just talked about, and the other is a chapter about the debates over the rapes of ethnic Chinese women. And that's the one part of the book that has no images in it, because the whole point of it is that it's sort of an image event manqué. It's an image event that lacked the image. And the argument I make there is that because the image had become a kind of fetish of the ideal of democratic transparency, in that all the hopes for what might be achieved in democracy in terms of accountability and truthfulness and the ability of the public to know the state's secrets, the state not to be able to hide its corruption and its violence anymore, completely foundered in the case of the ethnic Chinese women who were raped, because the women themselves refused to come forward, and they refused to be put into visibility. And they refused that because they knew that that they would not be protected. And yeah.
This is extremely important because this opens a window on another major theme in Karen's book, which is the legitimacy and authority of anybody is open to question, and in a contested place where transparency doesn't necessarily give you facts or tell the truth. And this plays out again and again and again, that photos are no longer considered to be truthful necessarily. And what is the truth anyway, and who has the authority to tell us the truth, becomes totally up for grabs as the years progress.
Yeah, and I just, the reason I wanted to bring that up is that you mentioned, Margaret, you mentioned the killing of Munir as this moment of sort of, you know, the major blow to this dream of reformasi, when it's sort of, you know, the most important political activist, reformasi activist, was murdered. And certainly, you know, I'd agree with you that that was a very decisive moment. But it's important to me that already in 1998, right in the same moment that there was all this euphoria and celebration, there was this debate about the Chinese women that already signaled a lot of failure. And that,
well said, Karen. Yeah.
So I just wanted to highlight that before talking about Munir. So one of the things I track in the book in couple of different places is the way that Munir's image has circulated in street art. And this has been a sort of concerted effort on the part of street artists to make him into a visible icon. It's often, I'm sorry, I didn't prepare another image that he's often accompanied by slogans like Manolat Lupa, Refuse to Forget. So, you know, he's become not just a symbol of himself, but of the entire kind of system of impunity and the failures of the post-Reformasi period to bring about what it promised to bring about, which was an era of accountability and justice. So I'm sort of, one of the things that I do in the book in different places is juxtapose these kinds of efforts to use the public space as a kind of forum for this kind of activism, but also that same kind of public space can also be used, you know, for imagery that serves anti democratic, you know, illiberal purposes as well, right? So that the public arena is an arena of contestation and struggle. And that struggle is being carried out through images. And sometimes, you know, it can be the image of Munir appearing on the same street with an image of Suharto, right? And these are kind of offering very different positions on both the past and the future. Sometimes what happens, so this is a very popular image that started to appear around 2013 of Suharto that says, you know, in very kind of colloquial language, how's it going? My era was better, wasn't it? Basically. And there are lots of iterations of this image, and it appears in all different kinds of forms. Also, you know, it's painted on the back of trucks, it's on stickers, it's on posters, it's on t-shirts. I mean, you name it, it's everywhere. But then also activists create counter images. This one says, how's it going? My era was better, wasn't it? Everything was cheap, including your life. Or this one, which says, how's it going, corruptors? My era was better, right? You were free to be corrupt. No one went to jail. So playing on this pro-Suharto sort of nostalgia for authoritarianism with counter images. This is some street art that is says over here, fight against political corruption, and has the same slogan. So this is a lot of how I'm trying to think about publics and public sphere as inclusive of public space. So that's one of the important points, is that I'm not restricting my understanding of the public sphere to things like the media and print and television, but I'm also looking at street art and also fine art. So that brings me to the other question that Margaret wanted me to bring up, which is a chapter that is about this artwork by a very prominent artist, Agus Wage, and in collaboration with the photographer, Davy Lingar. And this was a piece that became very controversial in the context of public debates about a pornography law that was eventually passed in 2008, and was one of the first laws alongside the electronic, what's it, the ITE law, I can't remember what it stands for, but the electronic communications law. These two laws, which were passed in the mid-2000s, were the first laws that really put limits on freedoms of expression. And so one in the name of pornography and one in the name of sort of slander and libel that is and fraud on the internet. And so these laws were kind of the first legal impingements on the freedoms that were won during Reformasi, after Reformasi. So this artwork probably would never have gotten much attention because it was in a very kind of esoteric, you know, elite space. But the male model in it happened to be a Cinetron star, a soap opera star. And word got out that he was in it, and crowds of young, you know, girls started coming, taking pictures of it, circulating them on cell phones. So it sort of became this mass media phenomenon, which was then picked up by the FPI, which is the Islamic Defenders Front, which is a group that has been active in Indonesia since 1998, and that one of the things it does is sort of police the public sphere. So they frequently have raids on, you know, brothels and films and other events that they see as violating Islamic morality. And so they basically forced a shutdown of this whole exhibit, and the chapter sort of charts this whole controversy around this one image and how it was reframed. This image became reframed in the media as pornography. So here you have the Cinetron star apologizing for participating in a pornographic image. And you can see how the artwork is taken completely out of context here. You no longer see it as part of a whole installation, you just see individual images. And the magazine has added its own censoring marks, which cover up the fact that there were already censoring marks within the piece. In fact, the piece was very much about censorship and desire. But that sort of all got obscured as the image traveled out of the art space into the mass media. It became reframed as pornography, and this was then capitalized on by the FPI and other supporters of the pornography law.
And hold on to that idea of reframing, because as the book goes along, reframing becomes an extremely important phenomenon. So we could go to the bridge, and you could, so the other thing that Karen does that is quite wonderful is that there's this morality and public space fight. There's reformasi, what does it mean? Who's going to fight for it? How do you fight for it? And then there's the neoliberal reality of the economy in Indonesia. And what does that do for transparency and pro-democratic values? Maybe we could hint at that with the bridge. Yeah, do you think that works for you?
Sure. Okay, so so the fifth chapter of the book is about images in public space, but it begins with an event that took place in 2013 around a bridge in Yogyakarta called the Kewek Bridge. And this bridge had been, since 1998, had become a kind of public canvas for street artists. It's in a very central location. It's quite large. It sort of has these big, big spaces that can, where many cars and pedestrian, mostly cars and motorcycles are passing through. Not so many pedestrians in Indonesia. But it's a very, very central location in the city. And it has been covered with art. Everything ranging from, you know, political street art that has a very activist kind of agenda to just sort of visually interesting graffiti. And there's a whole kind of ethics to what kinds of images or sort of the navigation of the space and who gets to access to it, how long an image gets put up before another image gets overlaid on it. And so there's a whole sort of informal economy around the work of street artists. But this area was was sort of colonized by street artists, and they claimed it, and they felt that it was, like, they referred to it as their canvas. And what happened was the city ended up leasing the bridge to an advertising company. And I'm sorry, I don't think I have that image of this is another image of art on it, but I don't have an image of the ads. But anyway, the city leased it to a cell phone provider company that started putting up its ads on the bridge. And this kind of created a sort of a war between street artists and other street artists who had been hired by the advertising company to put the ads up. And eventually a whole group of street artists and other sort of urban activists got together, because they also realized that this bridge was actually listed as a heritage site and as a historical monument. And so they, so actually it was supposed to be free of any advertising. It was not supposed to be sold by the city for advertising. And so street artists and sort of cultural heritage activists and other city urban activists got together, and they had this action, which they held on a historically very important day, a day of commemoration of the revolutionary siege, the general attack of Jakarta. So it had all these nationalistic resonances. And they reclaimed the bridge by painting it white, except for a couple of slogans. This one says that cultural sites and historical sites should not be used for advertising. And so the idea was that the artists also agreed to leave it white and to not use it anymore, and to respect it as a historical site and keep it pristine and white. And so this was a lot of the protest was in the language of Occupy. This was in 2013, so that people, you know, artists were very kind of aware of right to the city kinds of discourses, global discourses about neoliberalism and the privatization of public space. And there's a lot of activism going on at this time around those questions. So it really became not just about, not about the right to mark space, but really about the right of publicness itself, right? That there are spaces that should be public, that should not be privatized, and that the state was sort of abdicating its role as a protector of publicness and instead serving as a facilitator of private profit, right? And what ended up happening was that the advertising company said, well, hey, you know, we paid for this ad, you know, you got to let us use it. And so they came to an agreement that they would let the advertising company use this space until a certain date, and then it would revert to white. But of course, that didn't happen, and nobody enforced it, and it continued to be a place now of struggle between advertisers and street artists. So it was an action that was very much about creating an image event. It was the action itself was very spectacular, and it circulated on all sorts of media platforms. This image is taken from a documentary still, but it didn't really, it didn't change anything materially ultimately about the bridge, but it was an important moment in a kind of galvanizing of attention to this question of public space and who has a right to public space. Great.
There's so many other things to move on to. Do you think that the Compassus incident in Jogja is also worth spending some time on?
Sure. So part of the same chapter, where I'm looking at public space and contestation over public space, and looking at how these debates about public space become sort of proxy conversations about democracy itself. So in addition to the concern, so first you have the kind of idea, this very utopian idea that, street art is for everyone. It's about accessibility. It's about freedom to speak. It's about everyone being able to voice their concerns, right? And so there's a very kind of utopian language around street art among street artists, where they see themselves as really realizing the promise and the dream of democracy through their work. But at the same time, you have this incredible proliferation of advertising. So, and that was partly reflected in the in that debate over the bridge, right? Where the city is just becoming this like jungle of ads because it's completely unregulated. And to the extent that the state has any role, the state is just, collecting money. And certainly not enforcing whatever restrictions there are on length of time or where people can post ads. So there's a lot of talk about this idea of visual garbage that starts to circulate, where the advertising is seen as a kind of assault and a kind of messiness that comes to be connected to a sort of messiness of democracy. Everything's out of control. Democracy kebabasan, like it's over the top. It's not, the state is not doing its job, right? The state is not providing order. And so there's a certain kind of, you think about what's fueling that nostalgia for authoritarianism, right? It partly comes out of this sense that things have just gotten completely out of whack, too much. Everyone's talking. Okay, and then in the midst of this, there's an event that happens where I don't want to go into the details of the event, it's very intricate, but basically there's an extrajudicial killing of a petty criminal or a thug, a gang member kind of thing, by a member of the Kopassus, which is the special forces. And the special forces and its supporters launched this sort of public relations campaign where they defend the actions of this extrajudicial killing as a protection of the city from criminality. And they do that in large part, by putting up these banners all over the city. So using the kind of idioms and the spatial strategies of democracy activists to mark the space and claim the space and voice for the public a pro-military sentiment, as if it were public sentiment. And part of my argument is that that's not really any different from what the street artists are doing. I mean, I may be more sympathetic to the politics of the street artists, but they're also ventriloquizing the public and claiming to speak for the public. And part of the whole nature of public speech of these kinds is that there is no guarantee and there is no one behind it. There is no public behind it that you can reliably guarantee those statements. So, so this is all sort of happening at the same time. Is very, very violent statements that are being, just scattered all over the city, wherever they are, whoever they are, wherever they're from, they're still garbage, right? And one of the things that I was interested in was that, for a city that had a very active and politicized street art community, it was remarkable how little response there was to this kind of claiming of that same space for these illiberal ends. And one artist who I spent some time talking about in the book, who goes by the name Anti-Tank, did put up an image that basically plays on an idiom, maling teriak maling, which is thief calling thief, right? So it's like the kettle calling the pot black is the closest English idiomatic phrase. And so basically, I talk about what happened to his image and why it was that so few other street artists were willing to put their critiques out there in public, despite this kind of utopian investment in public speech in the form of street art.
It's an amazing image. So the lead up to the 2014 election, a lot of new forms, especially Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, texting, became a part of the vocabulary of the visual and the political, and you look into a lot of that. Do you want to lay tell us how we get to Duodati and how it fits into image events and contestation over reformasi?
So one of the things that happened is I worked on this book for a very long period of time because circumstances in my own life meant that I couldn't go to Indonesia for a year and do a concentrated, research fieldwork project. It was very episodic because of life. So what happened was that new media platforms kept emerging and shifting and sort of demanding attention from me, so that, whereas the earlier chapters are mostly about journalism and the press, then it starts to move into things like blogs, and then we get into social media. And so here we are in the concluding chapter is about the 2014 presidential election, and it really also is about the emergence of social media. Social media's figures earlier too, but this one is centrally about social media and the ways that the political campaign was conducted through social media, beginning with both campaigns. So you had a contest between Prabowo, who was a former general, a human rights violator, former son-in-law of dictator Suharto. So really a kind of very much a figure of the old regime. And then you had Jokowi, who at that time was still considered an outsider, considered to be he wasn't tightly tied into any kind of established political machine. He had a background as a businessman, so he was not tied to the military. And so you had this very sort of stark difference between these two political candidates at that time. So one of the things I look at is the way the images of them circulated, and also all kinds of scrutiny that images start to have in social media, so that pictures of political rallies start to become contested over, were the crowds really that big, right? So something that we've seen here with Trump in the inauguration was prefigured in 2014 in Indonesia, similar kinds of conversations. So crowd wasn't this big, they photoshopped it, blah, blah, blah. So I'm looking at those things, and also certain kinds of memes that are derogatory, that are insinuating that Jokowi is communist, that Jokowi is a puppet of other more established political figures, that Jokowi is really Chinese ethnically, and all sorts of things that are circulating. And then when we get to the election itself, I don't know if I should tell the whole story of the J. Subiacto image. Maybe I should skip that.
It's just extremely interesting that the campaign and this photographer worked together to make sure this iconic image went out and that it was proven to be an accurate show of this huge outpouring of people in the stadium.
Yeah, so there was a huge concert as part of a rally, as part of a support for Jokowi, and Jay Subiacto, he's a celebrity photographer, he's himself a celebrity, took a photograph from, you can see it here in the image, it's, from a screen that was behind Jokowi. He took this sort of iconic photograph, but there was all this language of, I need to prove that this really was real. And so I'm not only putting my professional career on the line, I'm personally, putting myself in harm's way, climbing, doing this spectacular feat. And I am kind of personally guaranteeing that this photograph is real. And what was interesting was that this image, this sort of double image, not just of Jokowi's crowd, but of the photograph of the crowd being taken, circulated as a pair all over social media and regular media. So what I argue, and he also continually talks about himself as not acting as in his capacity as a professional photographer, but acting as a volunteer.
Yeah.
And this language of being volunteers was very central to the support of Jokowi. It was a way of distinguishing Jokowi followers from a certain kind of image of the crowd. This is what I argue in the chapter. A threatening crowd that is kind of homogenized and is just sort of blindly following a leader, or is corrupted and has been paid to show up at a rally. By saying we're volunteers, there's a kind of claim of agency and of individuality that I argue is very consonant with a certain vision of neoliberal political democracy and agency that Jokowi kind of Jokowi supporters bought into. And so I look at this particular image as a kind of, I call it a crowd selfie, because he keeps emphasizing, the photographer keeps emphasizing that he is just like everyone in the crowd. He's just a volunteer. And so he's taking a picture of himself and the crowd. And I argue that that image is in some ways a hybrid, in that it looks like a traditional journalistic image if you just look at the image on the right side. But once they're put together, it comes to look a little bit more like these crowd selfies that circulated all throughout this the campaign, but in particular this one event, this concert that was just a couple days before the election, where people were posting pictures of themselves, sometimes explicitly saying, here I am, you can't deny that the crowd is big, right? So kind of anticipating the skepticism that images showing Jokowi's popular power would be met with. And other times sort of really, there's a very kind of sentimental language that is being circulated along with these images. I have goosebumps, I almost cried, this is awesome. This sort of very emotive language, a very personalized language.
And also, Karen, you do a very good job of talking about how there's a conception of being a citizen, that this agency, the volunteers, they cleaned up after themselves. It's a new kind of crowd, because under the dictatorship, the floating mass prevented crowds or looked down on them, and it was crowds were not allowed anyway.
Crowds were not allowed, or crowds were dangerous.
Right, crowds, yeah, violent, dangerous, yeah. And this is a rehabilitation of crowds as something positive and what good citizens do, which is extremely interesting. And we know that there's now a new kind of crowd, which is the Muslim crowd, which is how is given a mention quite at the end of the book. But we're not going to talk about post the election of Jokowi, because it's not fair to Karen, because the book ends with that election.
Yeah. It ends with a little coda sort of talking, just alluding to the emergence of a different kind of crowd in protests against Ahok. those of you in the audience who are Indonesianists will know what we're talking about.
Before we open it up to questions, and please, there are 2 in the queue, but please ask more. Karen, I'd love for you to talk about how this ideal of a transparent public sphere always was not sufficient for the aspirations of reformasi, and you make sort of some major points about why it wasn't enough.
Well, on one level, it's not enough because you can't have a genuine, democratic society if you don't have redistribution of resources and actual institutions of justice and all the things that underpin it. So there was, I think, the ideal of transparency that had such predominance in the Reformasi movement really set a lot of aspirations and hopes on the public sphere as the site where democracy would be realized. And I fully believe that that is vital, right? That you cannot have a democracy without a space for contestation and for debate, and not in a sort of neat Habermasian fashion, but that you need a vital communicative arena where struggles take place and where people struggle to gain political visibility. And to claim it and to shape it and to make things happen through that. So, but it's not sufficient on its own. And so I think some of the fetishization of transparency, of public visibility, of the photograph as a kind of emblem of that was misplaced or was misleading because it led to a kind of satisfaction or a kind of misplaced energy that allowed all sorts of other things to continue that of course undermine the realization of what we might, I'm not even comfortable with the word democracy, but a more just and fair society.
And as we've seen since you finished your book, the structural impediments have only become more clear, and that the just a belief in a transparent public space is just not going to be enough. Yeah. But the story continues. I mean, there's new image events coming all the time. Yeah. And Karen, I hope you get back to sort of help us understand. So please, I'm opening it to questions now. The first one, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's from a PhD candidate in media studies at the University of Buffalo. And she wants to know if you're following the current status of the image event in Indonesia, especially around the censorship about kissing scenes in cartoons or cut out, and athletes wearing shorts or low-cut tops or blurred, and totally reframing neutral images into the realm of semi-pornography and its correlation with the rising of religious groups in Indonesia.
I haven't been following that. I hope you have and you'll write about it. But I think that the chapter that we talked about Pink Swing Park is very much about that kind of, as Margaret said, is reframing where any image can become a pornographic image when it's framed in a certain kind of way. I also have a chapter in there that I think is the only chapter we didn't talk about, which is about the idea of the scandal and what I call a media genre of the exposure scandal. And one of the things that's very interesting in that is there's a kind of way that all different kinds of scandals, from sex scandals to corruption scandals, get sort of treated the same way in the media. So there's a kind of homogenization of vastly different kinds of forms of corruption. But anyway, you can see in those a similar kind of process that's going on where images are pulled out and they're framed as a certain kind of image. And then they're also, what's very important and what I'm very interested in is both the kinds of scrutiny that those images then get, right? Well, was this altered? Was it doctored? What was the real relationship between the image and the event? There's a lot of the work that these images do is to generate these kinds of conversations about the status of the image and the manipulation or potential manipulation of the image, and how do we know what we know? And so that seems to me to be very important. The other thing, and if you'll bear with me, I'll just share the screen again and show another image that we didn't talk about, is this idea, and I know, Margaret, you had mentioned wanting to talk about it, the idea of the ludic image. So one of the things that that I talk about throughout the book, but especially in this chapter on scandal, is the book sort of charts the career of Roy Sorio as an expert in discerning, truthful versus fraudulent or manipulated images, and this sort of quest for the authentic image. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is the kind of play that then goes into this whole idea that one could find the truthful image, this play around this fantasy of truth. And so the ludic image to me, and as I use it in this book, is a kind of counter to the evidentiary image. The evidentiary image is part of this apparatus of transparency. It's this idea that the image is going to be a truthful window onto some unmediated pre-photographic event, and it's going to tell us what that event was. And increasingly, what the kinds of images that circulate play with that by presenting a whole set of images that are playful and that don't try to make their claims through some kind of evidentiary status. Instead, they bring out truth through the kind of play that goes on at the surface of the image. So another example of that would be these money images, which I also consider to be ludic images, in that they take money and they play with its surface to make a different kind of statement that is a statement of authenticity, but it's not one that relies on a logic of transparency.
Great. Fadi, I am going to get to your question, but there's another question that is on a similar topic, so I want to get to that first, and then there's two other questions, and we have a bit more time. This question is, how do you see, how do you see the place of contemporary art, the type of art that might appear in biennials, for example, within the transformation of the relation between image and event? On the one hand, this kind of art is seen as an extension of global markets. On the other hand, it's often seen as a precious space for autonomous or even critical activity.
So one of the things that I was very interested in the Pink Swing Park case was that one of the lines of defense for the artists was the idea that art itself was a kind of non-public space, because it was a space of expertise and a space for a specialized kind of audience. And this argument, which was put forward by some defenders of the artists who were accused of pornography, sits very uneasily with another discourse that was part of the biennial that this artwork had originally appeared in, which was about making art open, making it into, putting Indonesia on the map of a global kind of art market, very explicitly, but also making art as part of a democratic and pluralistic space. So there are these two kind of competing ideas about art as embodying a kind of potential for publicness, that is global in scale, and as a kind of restricted arena that I don't think was fully resolved in that case. So I guess I don't have an answer for that, except that I think that this is a very interesting tension.
Okay, great. So we can move on. This is Fadi's question. The figure of the Preman, how does it play in the imaginary of democracy, especially in Jogja?
So I guess, I don't know the audience, so I don't know how many people know what a Preman is, but Preman is the sort of thug slash gangster. I mean, it's a social category with a very long and fraught history in Indonesia, back to the colonial period. And so it's, I think that I'm not sure. I don't have a answer for you, except to say that when this extrajudicial killing happened, it was really, really very remarkable. Maybe it shouldn't have been surprising, but it was to me, how quickly and readily the kind of discourse that, these people are garbage, who need to be eradicated, was and sort of the language of the nostalgia for the kind of state that in the 1980s killed off large numbers of Preman was very vocally spoken. And so I think that perhaps you could say that this is a figure that haunts the imaginary of democracy and reveals some of its limits, because it's clear that there are certain categories of people who, once they're categorized, are labeled in these ways, whether it's Preman or communist or gay or whatever, that these democratic ideals don't apply to.
Great. This next question is, could you briefly put demanding images into conversation with your first book, Refracted Visions? In what ways do you think of this new book as a kind of sequel, and in what ways are they standalone texts? Thank you so much, and can't wait to read this.
Well, I think they are very much, how would I say it? On the one hand, they're quite different, because Refracted Visions was really trying to understand personal and what I call popular imagery, but imagery that had that was produced in a very intimate kind of intimate projects of image making that were, what I was interested in was how those intimate images kind of put people into relation with and bound them to larger collective imaginings and formations. And this book kind of moves much more squarely onto the public terrain. And so it's really not about intimate relationships, intimate affiliations, intimate memories. That's not really the set of questions. So in that sense, it's a very different book. It is much more about the public, and as a result, ethnographically, it's very different, because these are images that don't always have clear clear anchors in terms of their authors. They're images that are kind of ungrounded in a certain kind of way that the images in Refracted Visions were not. So in that sense, it's very different, but it is a sequel in the sense that the end of Refracted Visions, very end, the little epilogue, kind of alludes to the emergence of a new era of images, in which the paper image is not, the primary way that the image exists. And so in that sort of technological sense, this book is very much a sequel, in that it's moving into a new moment where images operate in very different ways because of the technologies through which they circulate. And the other thing is that Demanding Images is about all kinds of images. It's not focused so closely on photography, even though the photograph is still very central to it.
Karen, that was great because it does give you a sense of the arc of your work. We're running out of time, but do you mind? I'm going to put together two questions and then you can do what you want with them.
Sure.
I hope you read these comments afterwards because they're very nice, but I'm just going to get to the questions. This one is about the current context of street art in Jogja. It seems to me that in the last couple of years, there's been less engagement from some of the artists you mentioned, anti-tank, here, that has happened in correlation with a number of factors, such as an increase in social media use, the continued formalization of the art market, and arts infrastructure in Jogja, as well as the disillusionment with the current political context. And I guess I want you to answer that because the other question is way different.
So I can see that it's Katie asking that question.
Yeah.
Hi, Katie. So you might know more about this than I do, is my answer. I certainly think that, the disillusionment was already on the rise in terms of disillusionment with formal politics, right? But I think that in the case of anti-tank, I don't know so much about what Here has been up to, but it seems like they've moved more into kind of different. They're still very active, actually, and there's a lot of activism, but it's not so much happening through street art. It's more collaborating with other activists working on things like water use and land claims and these kinds of issues around Yogyakarta. But I really haven't followed what's happened. I haven't been able to go back and, so you may know more than I do.
So Katie, when you have something on this, we'll get you to talk about it. By the way, make a pitch. Anybody that's not on the New York Southeast Asia Network newsletter, you should write me a note and I'll put you on it because we do have a lot of nice events. And now that Zoom is part of our lives, you can join from wherever. And this is somebody who's actually in Brisbane. And that is, I'm wondering what Karen thinks of the role of Indonesian artist Agan Harahap, who deliberately creates fiction, or rather a confusion of what's fact and what's fiction in this discussion of authenticity.
I think his work is really interesting, and I have thought about writing about it, and I just haven't had a chance, and so I don't really have anything to say about it yet, because I don't feel like I really have delved into it, but I have come across his work and I find it very, very, very interesting. But that's all I can really say at this point. But thank you for reminding me that that's something I would like to think more about.
And Karen, as you can see, that your book is so vibrant and brings us to so many different ways we could discuss, and we could go on for a very long time. But I think we should bring it to a close, and everybody, a virtual clap for Karen, who I think you did a fantastic job. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nia. Our coordinator, Shirnath Poole, is indispensable. We want to thank her too, and John and NYU and everybody. So thank you.
Thank you all for coming.